Among the Jungle podcast, where we're expanding our perception of the plant kingdom. Welcome. I'm botanist and host Shai Kaina, and I would love for you to join me as I interview incredible plant people around the world to create an audio vault of inspiring botanical knowledge, all while harnessing a deeper connection between us and our natural world. If you're ready, it's time to inspire your wild. Welcome back, Jungle Dwellers, to episode number 22 of Among the Jungle podcast. I'm so excited about today's episode, as we're exploring a kingdom slightly different than that of the plant kingdom, but with equivalent importance in the formulation and the future of the planet. In this episode, we join Dr. Gordon Walker on a magical journey of fungi, mycelium, mushrooms, and yeast as we explore their potent potential to revolutionize the world of beer and wine, as well as reestablish a healthy ecosystem across the planet. If you love any of the things mentioned above, you can thank the fungi kingdom. This is perhaps one of the most dynamic topics covered in an episode thus far, so let's dive in. Today we will explore the expansive world of fungi and how you can get started foraging, how essential fungi and yeast are in the regeneration of our planet, and the important role of the forager in helping to fight invasive species. Show notes for this episode can be found at amongthejungle.com/022. Get ready to explore a whole new world straight out of Fern Gully as we welcome Gordon to the jungle.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm happy to chat about fungi and all the things you can possibly want to know about this huge and interesting kingdom.
Yeah, so I would just kind of like to know if your background is in mushrooms and fungi, or if not, how you wound up on this journey.
My official background is definitely not as a mycologist. I would say unofficially I have become an expert, but very much by accident. My academic background was as a biochemist. I went to UC Santa Cruz, got a degree in biochemistry because it was sort of straddle the line between biology and chemistry, and I could never really decide which one I was more interested in, so I figured why not do both? And while I was in college, I drank a lot of beer, as college students tend to do. But I started wanting to drink better and better beer, and I realized that my friends who were brewers, some guys on the sailing team with me, were making really phenomenal beer. So I would go hang out with them on brew days, see what they were up to, and the thing that became really interesting to me was the yeast. And I got into homebrewing myself and realized very quickly that I was never going to be a great home brewer because I was kind of lazy and I wasn't a great engineer. But the most fascinating part of it to me was the yeast, was how that choosing a specific yeast could determine the style of beer you were going to make. Even when the rest of the ingredients were fairly similar, the actual strain of yeast you were using could pretty much dictate the flavors and the character of the beer that you were making. And there's some beers you can't even make if you don't have the right kind of yeast. So I was like, oh, that's cool. So when I was looking at grad schools to go to, I applied to UC Davis because they had a great wine and beer program, and food science and all this sort of stuff I was, interested in, having to do with food, with wine and beer, and just the world of fermentation that I was sort of getting really vested in. So I went to UC Davis and did a PhD in biochemistry again because I couldn't really decide which one was better. And I ended up working with a woman named Linda Basson, who was a very accomplished yeast geneticist. And she didn't work on beer, which was sort of a disappointment. But as it turned out, I think wine was a much better fit because I still love beer and I like wine, but I didn't have to ruin my love of beer by overanalyzing it the way I do with wine. So I came out of grad school with a really deep knowledge about yeast and the physiology of yeast, the dynamics of fermentation, and a little bit of knowledge about, like a fungal life cycle, what a spore is and how that goes into sort of the next phase of producing a new organism. And after that, I worked at a winery for a little bit. And then my partner, I ended up moving to New Zealand because she had a internship there. And I thought I was going to be teaching some wine microbiology. And as it turns out, the local university was just like not ready to have a free lecturer come in and teach anything. They were busy with harvest. And that was a year in New Zealand, 2017, when there was a huge typhoon that came through. So there's a ton of moisture.
Wow.
And I was bored. I was stir crazy in the house in a rainstorm. So I was, what can I do? I got to get outside. So I went to some of the local parks and I just started finding mushrooms everywhere. And I got really fascinated by what I was finding because I had been curious and interested in mushrooms as a kid. I'd found some in the woods. My mom and I had collected a couple of edibles. My dad had plugged up a stump with chicken of the woods. So I had this sort of early exposure to fungi and mushrooms. And I think right around the time my mom was like, okay, we're going to go join the Harvard Mycological Society and you're going to learn about this stuff. And then I'd hit like 11 and became a preteen and immediately was like everything that was cool as a kid was no longer cool anymore. So I kind of had a chance to come back to fungi after about 20 years of being away and start focusing on these mushrooms again. And it was something that I chose rather than it being sort of hoisted on me as a kid, which I think helps. But that early exposure as a kid definitely sparked some stuff for me. So I had hundreds of photos of mushrooms on my phone and no idea what any of them were. And that's when I decided to start an Instagram because I was like, what the heck do I do with this? And how do I form community? How do I find people who know what this stuff is? And previous to that, I'd used Instagram to post pictures of dinners or cute animals or whatever. And at some point I realized I was like, oh, wow, there are people on here who are posting lots of photos and seem to be fairly knowledgeable about mushrooms. So I formed a great community. And as a process of posting photos and kind of figuring out what things were, I ended up learning a lot because that's the best way you can kind of learn anything about fungi is like one at a time. And so I don't know, did that answer your question? So that was kind of a long explanation, but I think that's what we were going for. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're right. We actually talked about this in a recent interview that I had talking about something else, but we were actually talking about plants and how much you can learn about a plant when you kind of quote unquote get like a plant crush or you just kind of are like really into one plant for a while and you learn so much about its life cycle. And I imagine that the same is true about mushrooms. You come across one and really get into it for a while and learn a lot about it and its life cycle. I'm curious if you have ever come across, my husband is a brewer, my husband, I'm sorry, he works at a brewery. He's the general manager. But I'm curious if you've come across a mushroom beer combination.
I have, and this is actually way before I was into mushrooms. When I was at UC Santa Cruz, there was a local brewery that my friend was working as the brewmaster at called Uncommon Brewers, and they made a candy cap red ale. So candy cap is a small Lactarius. It's a little brown mushroom that smells strongly of maple syrup. So that's Lactarius rubidus, and it occurs on sort of coastal forests here in California under conifers generally. And it has a compound, it's a lactone called sotalon, which is the same compound that's in maple syrup, it's in sherry wine, and it's also in fenugreek. But it has this very strong maple character. And so they started making this beautiful red ale that had a little bit of sweetness on the end that had this incredible maple character, and you could smell it in the beer. It had a great after flavor. The one issue with it was that if you had a good number of these, candy cap red ales, you would wake up in the morning smelling like maple syrup, which is not the worst thing, but you could feel it seeping out of your pores.
Wow, that's crazy. So mushrooms have a scent? A strong smell or can have a strong smell?
Definitely some do. I think majority of mushrooms are going to smell a lot like what you would smell from a button mushroom in the store, which is kind of earthy, kind of indistinct and, whatever. But there are some that are renowned for their great smell. So the candy caps are one. There is an agaric, which looks fairly similar to like a button mushroom or a portobello, but it's called the Prince, and it has this beautiful almond kind of marzipan smell, and that's a really delicious one. Polypores in general, stuff like chicken of the woods and maitake and lion's mane, all have very distinctive smells, and they're a little woody because they grow on wood, not in dirt, and that definitely the substrate determines a lot of what a mushroom ends up smelling like. But those polypores have very distinctive smells. There's one called the bluet, which is a pretty popular edible mushroom. They cultivate it in Europe, not so much here, but it's kind of purpley, kind of brownish. And that's one that I had a hard time distinguishing for a long time because the bluets that grow here in Napa aren't super purple. And that's kind of one of the main determining things. But the other thing I learned from a friend was the smell of bluets. And bluets have this very distinctive smell of frozen orange juice concentrate that's like a little bit freezer burned. And anyone who grew up, eating from a cafeteria or something knows that exact smell. And that's what bluets have. So it's amazing because my background in wine really keyed me into sort of sensory stuff and smelling things and smell memories. The smell memories are so strong. And it's amazing how just a whiff of something can conjure a memory from 20 years ago. And so you get that with wine, but it was amazing to get that with mushrooms, because mushrooms are very, for me, they're very tactile. I want to feel them. I want to pick them up. And as you're doing that, you start smelling what's in them. And it's incredible what a diversity of amazing aromas there are in mushrooms. And not all of that translates to the food. Sometimes you just want to smell and kind of put it back on the ground. But, it is cool. So.
Wow, that's really interesting. I had never really thought about the aromatics of mushrooms before. I'm curious, from what you were picking up and discovering in New Zealand, if a lot of those are similar mushrooms that you're exploring and foraging in California.
So New Zealand was a great place to start for me, because in New Zealand there is a little less sort of diversity as compared to the entire United States. And I remember picking up mushroom books as a kid and sort of saying, well, there looks like there's some mushrooms that occur on the East Coast or the West Coast, but then there's things that say that they kind of occur in both places, and you never really know which one's which, and one's toxic and one's not. So it was just it's kind of scary. I think you pick up any kind of mushroom book and it can feel very intimidating. There's a ton of information. There's a ton of lingo. There's all this sort of specialized stuff that you have to recognize, these small differences. And if you haven't seen a lot of mushrooms, it's hard to even conceptualize what they're talking about. So in New Zealand, I was lucky. There was a great website called hiddenforest.nz, and it was a guy who devoted his life to cataloging the mushrooms of New Zealand. So I was able to go on that website and quickly get some visual keys as to, okay, these are New Zealand mushrooms. And New Zealand has an issue with like invasive mushrooms. So there's this little orange pork conch that's really, it was the very first mushroom I ever posted on Instagram. Beautiful little orange mushroom, and you'd see it all over the place. But it turns out it's invasive. It's from South Africa, and it's overtaking a lot of the other wood decay fungi that grow in New Zealand. So it's sort of interesting to like find things like that. Another one like Amanita muscaria, which is this very classic mushroom, and you find it all over the world. It's the red with the white dots on top. It is also invasive in New Zealand, and it grows all over the place because it's growing very, very well, and it's probably displacing some of the native species. But New Zealand was a great place to kind of start because I had less fear of things that might be poisonous. And there was one particular mushroom that sort of started my entire obsession. We went on a hike at a waterfall, and I found this like little brown fuzzy mushroom grown out of a tree. At the time, I had no idea, couldn't idea, but I took a bunch of photos. And later I had a friend kind of clue me in and say, hey, I think that might be this mushroom called Agrospe parasitica, which I looked up and found out that was native to New Zealand. It's related to piapini mushrooms, which you find here in stores and stuff like that. But these were, they would grow fairly large. And they were the only mushroom that looked like this in all of New Zealand. They're the only one that grew out of trees like this. It fit all the characteristics. And so I kind of keyed into that mushroom. And then when we got to Napier, after traveling around New Zealand for a bit, and we were living in Napier, I started finding that at one of the local parks. And so I was like, okay, I feel confident to pick this and eat it. And I did. And it was fantastic. And that was sort of a feeling safe in New Zealand, knowing that there was nothing else there that looked like this, gave me the confidence to kind of take that first step and eat something wild that I'd found. I got other verifications from people online that it was what I thought it was, kind of thing. But yeah, New Zealand was great to give me some sort of specific things to key into. But then what you realize about fungi in general is that the body plans, the types of fruiting bodies, the genre of mushrooms you find is pretty much the same worldwide. So if you key into certain mushrooms in one area, you can go somewhere else and say, hey, I think this kind of slippery thing is probably also a bolete, maybe a Suillus species. And then you can make commonalities. And usually something that's, edible in one way or in one place is going to be generally edible in another place. There are exceptions, but that's where, it pays to be careful and it pays to really pay attention to what you're picking. So yeah, New Zealand was a great kind of incubator space for me to feel comfortable and start learning about mushrooms.
And is there any etiquette or specific etiquette that goes into kind of that intro phase of exploring mushrooms as far as picking or over picking, or is there anything like that people should be aware of when getting started?
Yeah, definitely. The biggest thing is don't eat anything you can't identify, because, you'll be much safer off if you're only going to try eating something that you've been shown was edible. You can verify with multiple sources that it's edible. It fits the description of the habitat, the time of year, the spores. There's a lot of little things you can do to start keying out mushrooms. But definitely getting verification from somebody who knows, what you're looking at is a big one when you first start. But that being said, not everybody, and for me when I started, I didn't have an expert nearby who could teach me. So I was able to use the online tools. There's a great website and app called iNaturalist, and that's a resource I would recommend anybody who wants to get into mushroom foraging. And it's usually when people asking me, hey, how do I get started? It was like, go download iNaturalist. You can take a photo of literally any living thing, whether it's a plant, a bird, an insect, a mushroom, a slime mold, upload it. It will use its visual identification algorithm to key into most likely what it is. It's not always right, but 80-90% of the time it kind of gets you in the ballpark at least, which is really helpful if you know nothing about it, which is what happens to me with like birds or something. I don't know anything about birds, but I can take a photo and be like, oh, it's probably that kind of bird. So, and it does a fairly good job with mushrooms as well. But in terms of etiquette for getting started, I would say go to the woods, look around, be curious. Don't be afraid to touch mushrooms, because there's no mushroom that can really hurt you by touching it. I think there's like one single rare mushroom in Australia somewhere that can like hurt you if you touch it. But other than that, and
it
everything
would be in Australia.
Exactly. Everything in Australia is trying to kill you. So, but generally you can touch mushrooms without fearing anything. Like you don't need to lick your hands afterwards, because that's the harm from mushroom comes from consuming it. So again, you can touch them because the toxic compounds in mushrooms are not likely to diffuse through your skin. So that's why you can touch them without worrying about getting poisoned. Granted, don't eat something that you can't identify or you don't know what it is. There is a tool that some mushroom hunters use, and I don't do this that often, but some people do, is you can take a mushroom, toxic or not, and you can take a small bite of it and see how it reacts in your mouth. Some mushrooms are spicy, some are bitter, some are a little sweet. The aroma and the flavor kind of comes through. Then you spit that piece out. You don't chew it and eat it. You just spit out that raw mushroom. But it gives you a sense of, hey, is this mushroom spicy, or what is it? And that can sometimes help you determine edibility or help you hone in on the species. But again, that's kind of hardcore. Like you take this thing on the ground that was covered in dirt and you take a bite of it. Like I said, I don't do that often. But some people are really into it. Again, I like smell because it's a way to get the same sort of experience without physically putting dirt in your mouth. In terms of etiquette, I would say that it's a good idea to go out and touch and to pick. And if you're really curious, maybe take a sample home. But if you don't know what it is and you don't have an inkling that it might be an edible mushroom, just leave them there. There's no reason to fill your basket with a mushroom if you don't know what it is. And you don't even think it's, unless you know it's going to be edible or you're pretty sure it's going to be edible, just leave the mushrooms out there. That's the best advice I can give. But that being said, taking that one mushroom home, take it home, play with it, dissect it, smell it, do all the things, take a spore print, do all this stuff that you can to try to learn about that mushroom, just like you were talking about. Get obsessed with one, learn the one mushroom on every hike, and you'll be amazed how quickly you can learn all sorts of stuff by just kind of focusing on one thing at a time. So that's my advice.
That is so interesting. What is a spore print? I'm so interested by that.
So mushrooms are we're going to talk about what a mushroom versus mycelium is to talk about a spore print. Mycelium is the body of a fungi, and basically it is thousands of little leading white strands moving through soil searching for food. And that is the body of a fungi, is this sort of contiguous network of tiny fibrils moving through soil, moving through wood, moving through whatever their substrate is, because the fungi tend to live in their food. So that mycelial network is what's gathering water, nutrients, carbon from its environment. And if it's mycorrhizal, it's sharing that with the plant. If it's saprobic, it's just kind of locking it in and digesting it. When that mycelium reaches a point where it's had enough nutrients and it has good, there's enough humidity and water around, it will make the decision to fruit and produce a mushroom, which is the fruiting body or the reproductive organ of a fungi, or of these mushrooms. And so that there is a real difference there between this sort of diffuse network of mycelium that is the real body, and then the mushroom, which is what we see. And we always sort of anthropomorphize mushrooms as being the actual organism, when in truth it's more similar to like a fruit or a flower. The difference from a flower is that if you pick the mushroom, it doesn't kill the plant. It doesn't, get rid of the next generation of fungi, because the mushroom is there to disperse the spores of that fungi out into the environment. And sort of like a fruit, the spores are like a seed. They're seeding the next generation of that fungi, or even spreading the range of that mycelium over this particular environment. And that's kind of the whole body plan of a mushroom. The fact that it grows up in a stem and there's this cap is to get it higher off the ground, because the gills or whatever's underneath the cap is where the spores are coming out of. And so you want to get it kind of as high up as possible, and you want it so the wind will carry some of those spores and help distribute them. You can use the spore color as a great identification tool. And this is a really good thing for beginner mushroom hunters to do, because it's great, it's interactive, it gives you an excuse to bring a mushroom home. You say, hey, what is this mushroom? You bring it home, and you want a mushroom that's in pretty good shape. You don't want an old one, because it's going to end up rotting in your kitchen. So you want one that's in pretty good shape. When you bring it home, you just cut the stem off kind of near the base of the cap. And then you take the cap and you can put it on white paper. Is not that great, because a lot of mushrooms will have like a white spore print. You'll never see anything. Black paper can be good if you have white spores, but if you have black or brown spores, black paper may not be that great. I think my favorite to use is tinfoil, because it's pretty shiny and you can see the spore deposit regardless of what color it is. With tinfoil too, you can make sort of a larger piece. And if you get a nice little spore print that's in a circle, you can fold in the tinfoil and save those spores for later, in case you ever want to try growing that mushroom, or you want to share it with somebody as a microscopy or something like that to help you ID it later. But that spore print, the color of the spore print, can give you information about what kind of mushroom you have at hand. And another tip for it is, if you usually want an area where there's not a lot of airflow, so the spores aren't getting mixed up. So if that's the case and you don't have that in your kitchen, you always like put a bowl upside down over the mushroom, just to help make sure the spores don't get disturbed. But that's what a spore print is. So.
Wow. So after a mushroom drops its spores, those begin to develop into more mycelium, which then eventually will create more fruiting bodies, just like a plant would produce flowers seasonally and fruit to drop seeds and start its kind of life cycle over again.
Yeah, bingo. Except that even those spores can go out and seed new mycelium that may join up with a previous mycelium and make a wider contiguous network of mycelium all across the forest floor. The other cool thing about mycelium is there's lots of promiscuity. So mycelium from different fungal species may merge and share nutrients. And they may even exchange pieces of DNA in a process called horizontal gene transfer. Fungi are really good at just taking up naked hunks of DNA and kind of trying it out in their genome, see if they like it or not. Similar way that bacteria will absorb pieces of DNA from other bacteria and gain antibiotic resistance or something like that. Fungi can do that. And across this mycelial network, they can send tremendous amounts of water and nutrients and minerals and sugars, and share nutrients across the entire forest floor, such that old trees can send nutrients to young trees. And it's a very dynamic process that kind of changes as the season goes on, because the give and go between the trees and the mycelium, the fungi and the soil is wholly dependent on the photosynthetic capacity of those plants. And in the summer, the trees may be feeding more sugar down into the mycelium and into the roots because they're producing a lot of stuff. But in the winter, when they've dropped all their leaves, the mycelium, the flow of carbon may be in reverse, that the carbon is going from the roots and the mycelium back up to the tree. So it's all very dynamic, and it's, it sounds very hippie to say, but everything is connected. And in a forest, it really is. It's tangibly connected through that mycelium, which is just, it's so cool to see.
I recently watched a documentary that was about trees and about the chemicals that they release in the air that we interact with, but also it was talking about the neural network below the ground and how the trees, while their root systems can be somewhat intertwined, for the most part, it's this mycelium network that's below the ground that's really connecting all the living organisms and making sure that, like, if there's not enough nutrient over here, that they're spreading it from those abundant places of nutrient and really making the forest the abundant place that it is. I just think that's
absolutely.
so fascinating.
It's amazing
it's
way
like a
that
brain
nature,
underground.
Yeah, nature buffers itself because it's able to, like you said, if there's an area of deficiency, it can take, stuff slides downhill energetically. And so the entire forest benefits from the fact that it's all connected. And that's why they're so robust. That's why, the great old growth forests of the world need to be protected so badly, because there's such diversity. There's so much life there that buffers it against the environmental changes. And we need to encourage that mycelium to grow as much as we can across as many ecosystems as we can, because it's a huge part of how we sink carbon back into the soil as well. And as well as making plants healthy and making everything healthy. Soil and mycelium is sort of the base of all of it. The glue that holds life together.
I'm curious how mushrooms and plants interact. So I used to think that they interacted pretty similarly, like with one another as fellow plants, so to speak. But I recently heard, and I'm going to ask to verify if this is true, that while plants produce oxygen, I heard that mushrooms actually have more of a process like us, and they actually more breathe oxygen and release carbon like we do. Yep. Is that true?
Yeah, totally. So, that's one of the big things is mushrooms were misunderstood as plants for most of our scientific history. And it wasn't until about the 70s that the mushrooms got their own, fungi in general got their own kingdom and were differentiated by science from plants.
Wow, that's not that long ago.
No, it's not that long ago. And I think that really underlies how much we don't know about fungi. And that's to say we know a lot, but there's still so much that we don't know because we had been kind of ignoring them. They're kind of cryptic. They're kind of hard to study. That mycelium in the soil, like I said, it could be hundreds of different species of mycelium, but you would have no idea what they were until you started doing DNA sequencing, which is one of the things that's led us to realize how much we don't know, how many blind spots we had, because there's all this information we're now gathering, and we still don't know how to put it into context yet, but we're learning. So the
DNA sequencing has opened up so many doors.
It has. It absolutely has. And it's, it really is mind blowing how much more we're learning about the world that, especially things we took for granted as being, oh, this is that and that's that. And we learned that, two organisms we thought were totally separate might actually be the same organism. They just have different life cycles, and that's where you're seeing it. And that's especially true with fungi. So the fundamental difference there between plants and fungi that you mentioned is that plants are anabolic, meaning they make their own carbon. So they're using the energy of the sun and water to fix atmospheric CO2 into sugars. Fungi are like animals in that they're catabolic. So they're breaking stuff down. They're burning sugars rather than building stuff. And that's, their fundamental role is as the recyclers of carbon and nitrogen along with bacteria in our soils to help break stuff down. And in an interesting way, plants and fungi have always been intertwined because the movement of algae and aquatic fungi onto land was concurrent. They had to come to land together. And that was because fungus alone, if it doesn't have any sugar, it can't go anywhere. And plants, if they don't have any water and they don't have any minerals, they're not going to grow. And so together, plants and fungi slowly started terraforming our planet. And the fungi were able to grow hyphae down into the soil, start breaking up the rocks, extracting minerals, and keeping water present in, imagine the surface of Earth like the surface of Mars, this giant, dusty, dry thing. And fungi were the ones that were able to keep the moisture there and access the minerals and the nutrients that were locked away in the rocks, making them bioavailable for the plants. And the plants, in turn, were able to make sugars and feed those fungi and continue that growth. But it hasn't always necessarily been a fair partnership. There's a lot of push and pull. And that's kind of what I mentioned about that dynamic nature of mycelium in plants is it is symbiotic, but it's also sort of a push and pull as to like, well, I need more now and you need more then. And it's, there is a big push between them. But it is really interesting to kind of look at the fundamental difference there between fungi and plants, because so many people misunderstand that and just lump them in together and say, oh, fungi are plants. And you're like, well, fungi are a absolutely crucial part of how plants operate. And most plants, there's a lot of plants that won't grow at all without their fungal partners. Even something like orchids. I don't know if you knew this, but I learned this somewhat recently, that orchids cannot germinate unless there's a fungi present. And what they do is an orchid seed kind of looks, it mimics looking like a piece of dead whatever, and the fungi, it's like attracting fungi to come digest it. And what happens is as soon as the fungi penetrates the orchid seed, the orchid hijacks the mycelium and takes all the water and the nutrients it needs. So orchid seeds really, there's no like germ to them. There's no capacity for an orchid seed to germinate on its own. It has to have fungi to get the nutrients and the water that it needs. And so they go from being like, sort of obligate symbiote with fungi to later in life, they may not need the fungi, but the seed always needs some fungal partner to germinate, which just blows my mind that, that kind of relationship exists.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that is so interesting. I have been reading a book called Making Eden, and what I found so fascinating about this book is in the very beginning, it starts diving into how the earth turned from this rock water body to having actual living things, and from bacteria to actually turning into, like you're saying, lichen and mycelium really penetrated all those rocks and turned everything into the soil that we have now. Plants and mushrooms are really responsible for earth as we now know it and can cultivate it. And I thought it was so fascinating that those two kingdoms came together to form the earth, but I had no idea that it was the mycelium that was holding so much of the water. That is really, really interesting.
Yeah, totally. And if you think about it too, like the areas that are, what was the Dust Bowl? The Dust Bowl was getting rid of all of this grass that had a thick layer mat of mycelium below that would hold the moisture. And when you till, you're breaking up mycelium and you're not necessarily reseeding it with more organic matter, and you're sucking nitrogen out of the soils. And eventually you create these very poor soils with virtually no mycelium. And then there's nothing to hold everything down. And that's, the wind comes up and there goes your soil, there goes your topsoil, and that's a Dust Bowl. And we're looking at major desertification events all over the planet right now in pretty much every major agricultural area of the planet. And it's terrifying. I mean, we are witnessing the collapse of our food systems, and we really, really need to turn it around and change some of our practices and be more focused on mycelium as a mesh, as a net that helps keep carbon and water in the soil, and continues to build that soil rather than thinking we need to constantly pump in nitrogen as fertilizers and stuff like that for productivity. We have to recognize there's a more sustainable way, because the way we've been doing agriculture and farming for so long is so unsustainable that it's just become the norm that it's unsustainable, and chemical fertilizers made everything worse. We have to kind of take a step back and say, okay, there are ways to achieve the productivity. There are ways to feed everybody, but we have to change our practices, because 20, 30 years from now, we're not going to feed anybody if we don't have any soil or capacity to grow stuff. So.
It's seed starting season, friends, and I'm not making the same mistakes I made last year. If you remember, I purchased cheap, unbalanced lights online to start my seeds, and after waiting all that time for the trays to germinate, I began to notice my seedlings were looking super leggy. That's when I was inspired to take a deeper look at my lights, which wound up being completely unbalanced and caused me to have to scratch all my trays and start over, getting a late start in the garden. Fast forward to this year. I've been using Sono Farm. That's S-O-N-O Farm, a system I actually trust to grow strong seedlings. But that's not all I'm using it for. I've also been using this incredible light to rehabilitate unhealthy houseplants and experiment with new plants I've never had enough light to have indoors before, like palms, crotons, and a variegated pink lemon tree. The grow panels are easy to install, have adjustable light settings, and give the full spectrum of light required for healthy plant growth. Sono Farm is offering 10% off to listeners using the link in the show notes or in the bio of any of our social medias. Give your houseplants the light they need to thrive and your seedlings the best start possible for a bountiful harvest this fall.
Right. I mean, I kind of think of synthetic fertilizers as kind of like putting your food in the microwave. Like, yeah, it warms it up, but it devoid it of all nutrient that was left within it. And it's kind of the same with fertilizer. Yeah, it gave that nitrogen boost, but it could have poisoned a lot of things, a lot of the living bacteria and a lot of the things that are alive within our soil. And over tilling and over farming have such a negative impact that are so much larger than that one little piece of land that you're overusing. Since I was in college, every landscape job I've done has always been with mushroom compost. And I have found it has been such a life-giving force to gardens using mushroom compost in the spring. And I'm curious, so with using mushroom compost, of course, there is a lot of mycelium in there. There's a lot of spores going on. And as your garden starts to grow and things get wet, mushrooms will start to come up. And sometimes they can even come up in your inside plants. I've had that happen a couple times. So what do you do in that case? Is that something to be concerned about? Should you remove those?
So I get this question a lot. People text me and say, hey, this mushroom came up in my yard. It came up in a house plant or something. Should I get rid of it? Is it toxic? Is it poisonous? Is it harmful? And the general answer is no, most of those mushrooms aren't harmful. One in particular, a lot of people who've had this experience who keep houseplants is there is a yellow mushroom called the yellow dapperling that will, I think it's a leucocoprinus or something like that. It will show up in your houseplants. It's very common in houseplant potting mixtures, and you will see it again and again. That mushroom is toxic, but it's not toxic to your plants. It's just toxic if you tried to eat it. So don't eat those little yellow mushrooms, but leave them be. It's just a sign that you have healthy soil. And letting them fruit and go back into the soil will just ensure that you'll have more generations of good mycelium and healthy soil in your potted plant. So it's just, if anything, it's a sign that you're doing a good job taking care of your potted plants, or maybe that you're overwatering ever so slightly. In the garden, there's a lot of mushrooms that they add to soil mixtures, particularly, if you've used topsoil or something, they're adding mycelium to it. There's one mushroom in particular called a Pizolithus. Dead man's foot or dieball are common names for the mushroom. But it is a great pioneering species, and it's really good at forming a thick mycelial mat, co-opting plants to it'll symbiote with a whole bunch of different plants. So it's really good. And it's really good at like colonizing areas of disturbance. And so it's one of these species that they add to a lot of potting mixtures. And dieballs, or these Pizolithus mushrooms, are super interesting because they are some of the strongest mushrooms out there. They literally can reshape soils because as they grow, they literally look like a turd rising up out of the ground, which is why they're called the dog turd fungus sometimes. But there's these brown things, and they can exert somewhere between like 80 pounds of force per square inch. So I have seen them lift up asphalt and concrete. They are absurdly strong. And that's one of those things that they add them to these soil mixtures. So if you have compacted soils, this mushroom will lift the soil for you. And that's one of the ways that we look at like no-till agriculture, that we can still accomplish oxygenation and mixing of the soils through mushrooms, because they push up through, whatever layers on top of them. It's not just the pushing up and aeration of the soil. The thing that I've realized somewhat recently is that when you have a mushroom come up, you've made a hole. You now have a channel that goes directly down into the soil, and not just down to the soil, directly to the mycelium. So if you go ahead and you water your garden after a bunch of these mushrooms have come up, that water will go down the hole and right into the mycelium, and it'll stay there. So having lots of mushrooms come up is aerating your soil, but it's also making it easier for the water to get to where it needs to go into the mycelium and stay there. So your watering will be more effective when you have a lot of mushrooms in your garden. And the more mycelium you have, the more water holding capacity your soil has. So in that sense, if you see mushrooms in your garden, great, leave them be. If anything, you can go ahead and seed your garden with edible mushrooms. I don't know if you're familiar with the wine caps or Stropharia rugosa annulata, but they call them garden giants and stuff like that. And you can basically mix up spawn with some straw, and as long as you have about 3 or 4 inches of straw, which you use as like weed cover or something in your garden. If you're watering your garden, you're watering that spawn, and you'll get mushrooms.
What I found really interesting is we expanded our garden beds this year. It was our first year in this house, and we expanded the garden beds, and we have these big rocks that we have as the border of our garden beds, and then we filled them with soil. And about halfway through the season, I started getting these ginormous brown mushrooms. They were huge, and they literally pushed the rock edging away from the garden bed. They just like came up and just pushed the rocks right out of the way. And then we had this whole like we just have this like one area that's like a mound of phlox, and it just looks like a big thing of grass. And that's also how it grows. And this mushroom came up and lifted that whole pad like right up from the ground. It was like growing up and out from underneath. I could not believe it. I was like, the strength of these mushrooms right now is blowing my mind. That was the first time I had seen them like move rocks.
Right.
It was crazy.
It is. And that when you see that kind of power, you start to think back to, I guess this is part of how they reshaped our planet. You take that one phenomenon of you going, wow, they moved a rock, but you multiply that by hundreds of billions of times all across our planet every single year for a couple million years. And you're like, that's how soils were created. That's how we break things down. And it really is just phenomenal to kind of start viewing the world through the eyes of a mushroom or even a plant rather than our human perceptions, because there's so much that we kind of impose on nature, and we love to try to categorize things. And the one thing I see with fungi is they throw off categories like it's nothing. Like I said, they exchange genetic information. They can like meld bodies into each other. I mean, the entire concept of mycelium is like a body plan that challenges the human imagination. We can't imagine having like 1,000 different heads leading in 1,000 different directions, and then somehow all being able to coordinate at the same time and respond to environmental conditions and cues like sunlight and moisture and bacteria and plant. I mean, there's so much communication that goes on in a language that we don't know how to interpret. So we just assume that it's not happening. But you've seen that with plants. Plants communicate all the time through pheromones and other things, and human beings we're just these big, stupid animals bouncing around the world, causing everything else to talk about us in their wake kind of thing. But
it's so true. Like I already mentioned that documentary I was watching, and I'll link it in the show notes too, because it was so interesting. The ways that plants and fungi and all types of things communicate with us, even animals, is so much different than the way that we communicate with each other. And we always say that when we go out into the woods, we feel so good. We feel so euphoric. Nature regenerates us. But I actually learned that those are chemical processes, that the trees are actually putting off into the air, and we go out into the woods and breathe that, and those chemicals interact with our brain and release dopamine and serotonin and oxytocin and all these things that make us feel so good inside. It's an actual chemical thing that's happening. It's not just, I'm around a plant and I feel good. There's all these ways that plants are communicating and having an influence on us that we don't even know about because they're completely invisible or inaudible.
We talked about aromas of mushrooms. That aroma is a form of communication. And I mean, the smell of a flower is a form of communication. I mean, they're all talking constantly, and we just perceive things as sensory inputs, but that could be their language. And so it really helps to kind of shift your perspective. That's cool stuff.
Yeah, it really is. And that was one thing that's kind of fascinating. I know everybody was so interested in hooking up the music of the plants device to mushrooms. And I like people to understand that the device isn't the way, that music isn't the way the mushroom is trying to communicate with us. Mushrooms are trying to communicate and plants are communicating in all different kinds of ways. This device is just allowing us maybe to hear what's going on in between water molecules in there.
Almost of the noise and the energy that's happening. We can't hear it. And I remember at some point somebody contacted me for an interview and was like, hey, do mushrooms make noises? And I sort of was like, well, not inherently. I mean, you can I take mushrooms and pat them all the time. People love that kind of stuff. And I was thinking, I was like, well, I guess if you put a mic down beside a mushroom that was growing, if you took one of those mushrooms that was shifting a rock, you could probably record it making noises over time. But in real time, I was like, mushrooms don't really make noise, but it's because I'm not listening the right way. You get your little electrodes, you hook them up, boom, mushrooms make music. It's a translation. That's all.
Yes. And that's all that device is just a translation from some of the ways in which they communicate to ways that we communicate. We communicate through, hearing and through speaking. And that music box just allows us to kind of say, wow, there is something going on in there that I didn't know was happening before I hooked up those electrodes. But really, when you think about it, you don't need a music box or anything to communicate with the natural world. There's so many ways that we can kind of open up our perception to be more aware of them. I'm curious what kind of things that you're into now.
Thanks to COVID, I'm not super employed. I'm a little bit employed. I'm doing a postdoc at UC Davis where I'm working on wine yeast again, but I'm looking at what we call a process parameter. So I am trying to take a particular kind of probe, which is what's called a redox probe or an oxidation reduction probe, and we're putting that into wine fermentations. And what we're trying to do is get a better sense of what yeast are doing in real time metabolically. Because traditionally, all you really track when you're looking at wine ferment is you watch the density as a measure of sugar. It's basically called Brix, and it falls. And then your temperature, which sort of comes up to something around 80, 90 degrees, and then, sits there and then goes down. And so that doesn't give you a whole lot of information about biologically what's happening inside the tank. And when I always tell people, is especially if we're thinking about a premium bottle of red wine, that's about 4 years of time from the time the grapes started growing to the wine getting the grapes getting harvested, crushed out, turned into wine, and then maybe another 2 years in barrel and maybe even another year in a bottle or something like that. So it can be a fairly long process, drawn out process. And everything you do with winemaking is, for the most part, corrections outside of about a 2-week fermentation window. And that 2-week window is where the wine is actually being made. Everything else you do outside of that is just kind of these little course corrections. And so I'm trying to get the wine industry to pay more attention to what happens in fermentation, because that's when you can actually control some of the volatiles that are produced by the yeast. And at the moment, we have no real control strategy, which is funny to me because I worked in biotech sales down in the Bay Area, and I went to a lot of companies that have a little bioreactor. So it's a little tank with all these controls of temperature and pH and dripping glucose and all this stuff, so they can exert very specific control to produce a lot of a certain protein or something like that. And if I went to one of those companies and I'd say, okay, you have this container, the product is worth thousands of dollars. Would you run your process without all of these control probes? And they would look at me like I was crazy. They'd be like, no, that's not even allowed. We can't, the FDA says we can't produce a drug unless we have all of these controls present. And yet the wine industry is like, okay, we have all these tanks. We're going to put in thousands of dollars worth of grapes. Sometimes in Napa, the price of a ton of grapes can go upwards of $30,000, $40,000 a ton. So imagine filling a 20-ton tank with stuff like that. They don't usually make 20 tons of, grapes that expensive, but still it's a huge investment. And then they don't have any probes. They have maybe one half-ass temperature probe and some guy who comes around once or twice a day to kind of check the sugar. And so what happens in the wine industry is there are problem fermentations. There are things that happen and people don't really know why. They can try to fix them after the fact, but they didn't know what led to the problem in the first place. So my work with the wine industry and what I've been doing with this postdoc is trying to get people to start using these oxidation reduction probes as a way to gain more information about what's happening with the yeast in real time, whether you should give them more oxygen, whether you should give them more nutrients, if you could lower or raise the temperature to kind of help them out, maybe even if they're being attacked by a competitor or something like that. So this is trying to give winemakers more information. Which is surprisingly difficult to do because a lot of them want to think that they are the ones who make the wine, when in reality it's the yeast, it's the fungi that make the wine. And so, I'm talking to one of the guys I knew from UC Davis back in the day. He worked at a lot of breweries, big ones all over the world. And he's like, you know what? At a brewery, your yeast are your most important employee. So it's really important to take care of them. And I feel the same way at a winery. It's really important to care your yeast. It doesn't matter how good of a storyteller your winemaker is. If he can't manage his yeast well, his wine's not going to be good. So I'm trying to get people to buy into this idea of using a little bit more process control and gaining some deeper insights into what's happening, because they'll get more consistency. And for me, some people are like, well, aren't you afraid of taking away the magic of winemaking? I'm like, no, I think it's super magical that we can do all of this incredible science and gain this resolution. The fact that yeast have evolved this biology in some ways is magical to me. I look at the world of science as magic. It's quantifiable, really cool magic. I don't, have Harry Potter spells to cast, but I can understand and set up an experiment that might give me a result that would seem magical if I didn't understand everything that went into it. And I see magic and science as two sides of the same coin. It's just a question of how you want to phrase it.
Yes. Magic is definitely a perspective in my mind. Just because science, people say that with a lot of different spiritual modalities and stuff too. It doesn't matter what it is. Science and what we perceive to be magic is really so hand in hand. It's really that science is just coming along and proving that magic is real, that all these things are actually possible that we thought were impossible. So I love that bridge there. I'm curious if foraging and learning about mycelium, about yeast, if that has changed your palate in the way that you eat and the things that you enjoy.
I've always been really interested in eating mushrooms. I think, I found a puffball as like a 5-year-old, and that was just a transcendent experience. My mom knew enough to say, this is edible, let's take it home. Brought it back, cut it open. It was all perfectly white inside. It was a good one. And just frying that up in a little bit of butter and salt. And my first taste being like, whoa, what is this savory, marshmallow? I'm blown away by this. And Mom, I want more. And she's like, can we go to the store and buy more? She's like, no, there's no stores that sell this. You have to go find it. There's no other way to get it. And I was like, and for years I have gone back to that field where we found the puffball and looked. No such luck. But, someday I'll find another big one. I think definitely being into mushrooms caused me to eat more mushrooms. And in that sense, it has shifted my palate a little bit. I think being really into yeast got me to try a lot more beers and a lot more wines. And so in that sense, it definitely developed a palate. I gained a deeper understanding of what metabolic processes would lead to certain flavors. So again, when I try people's home brews, I can say, tastes like clove, which means that you didn't have very good temperature control, which I'm sure, your husband who works at a brewery can tell you. He can identify a beer that was not fermented well or without good temperature control, because it's going to have certain off characters. And that's one of those things. I do love homebrewers, but man, I can't drink homebrew because it doesn't taste that good, which is one of the reasons I stopped doing it, because I'm never going to make the beer the quality of what I want. So I'm just going to buy the beer and I'll enjoy the contributions from the yeast in that way. But for eating food, definitely, I have explored and eaten a lot more different types of mushrooms, and it's keyed me into things to, I used to say that I liked portobellos. Why not? Portobellos taste great. But now I can say I don't really like them that much compared to other mushrooms that I've now tried. Something like a portobello, it's very strongly flavored. The texture is okay, but there's other mushrooms that I've tried. I'm like, wow, I really like the flavor. I really like the texture. I really enjoy the biology, the look. There's so much more things out there that got me excited about it. So yeah, definitely, I'd say that getting into yeast and mushrooms has changed my palate for the better.
That's so interesting. When I moved up here last year to Alaska and started working at the Alaska Botanical Garden, we have all these books on mushrooms. And like you're saying, at first it seems so overwhelming. And I take my dogs to the dog park every day, and there are just thousands of mushrooms. And some days I see people leaving the dog park with arms full of mushrooms. And I'm like, what do they have? What do they know that I don't know? I'm just so curious because I learned that Americans eat less than 0.001% of all available like vegetables and plant-based foods on the planet that are available and edible for us to eat. And it's like when you just open up the world of mushrooms, it seems like that's a very realistic number because there's just so much out there. And like your mom said, you can't just go to the grocery store a lot of times and buy this stuff. You have to, a lot of the stuff is just out there like wild and available to be eaten once you just
definitely.
kind of
I'd say that the world of foraging is really compelling, but it's not something that's sustainable enough for everybody to do it. And not everybody's going to have access to it. I'd say if you are interested and you are vested and you have time, you have access, go for it. But again, there's practices you can do. Like if you find a really big chanterelle patch, don't take all of them. Harvest 25, 50% of the absolute best specimens. Leave the old ones, leave the young ones, make sure that there's enough around so you carry on the next generation of stuff. Ramps are a thing that people are super excited about foraging, but ramp populations all over the US are declining because people are over foraging. And honestly, ramps are not that much different than a green onion. Go to your garden and grow some green onions. There's things that we can do. And same with mushrooms. I'd say that there's probably not enough forage mushrooms for everybody to go out and pick them, but there's plenty of ways to grow mushrooms at home. I have some mushroom kits right now, and I'm growing lion's mane. I grew oyster mushrooms. There's a lot of things that you can get and grow at home. There's those like wine cap mushrooms. So there's a lot of ways to supplement and grow and make these things sustainably. And then there's a whole set of saprobic mushrooms. These are mushrooms that grow on dead organic matter. And basically the way they grow mushrooms commercially, this is not the Agaricus bisporus, but all the other mushrooms. These are wood decay fungi. And generally they're what are called primary saprobes. So they are white rot fungi that can digest the lignin in the wood. Secondary degraders are the ones that degrade the cellulose. And then there's like tertiary degraders that basically degrade compost. And that's what Agaricus bisporus, your standard button mushroom portobello, is all growing on compost. And usually it's composted chicken poop, which I'm not crazy about anyhow. So I like things that are growing on wood primarily. And the way they do that commercially is they get sawdust. They generally supplement with some rice bran. And then they get that mixture wet. And they'll pack it into bags or jars and sterilize it. And then they'll inject a needle with some spores into it and let that bag or that jar colonize. And that's where you're getting stuff like oyster mushrooms, king trumpets, maitake, namikos. There's a really good selection of about 10 or 12 delicious edible mushrooms that can be commercially cultivated off of sawdust. And those are not always available to people. But if you go to like a local Asian grocery store, you can find a huge selection of them. And again, you're up in Alaska, so it might be hard to find like a good local Asian grocery store. You can find that stuff, but you can order kits and you can order spawn and start. I have like 3 or 4 mushroom projects in the backyard that fruit fairly regularly, and I can supplement my food with just a pile of wood chips. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I was going to mention if you are looking for some of those different types of mushrooms, the Asian markets are some of the best store type places that I found to find things outside of just the regular portobello and the little brown mushrooms and stuff that you find at the grocery store. But I wanted to kind of focus in on what you're saying a little to expand that to all things that within foraging. Yes, you can forage mushrooms, but you can forage berries and pine nuts and herbs that are growing wild. And there's so much out there. The earth is so abundant, but overtaking in any one particular category, whether it just be mushrooms or whether it be houseplants. I just posted something yesterday on our Instagram because in a lot of areas where the plants now that we're bringing home, we're bringing everything home. And some of these plants are native to, South America or Southeast Asia. And now poachers are going out and taking what's left of these wild specimens to sell for thousands of dollars to people that are just going to maybe potentially kill it in their house. And so it's really important to think about sustainability in everything that we do, whether we're interested in mushrooms or berries or houseplants or whatever it is. Sustainability is something that we always have to keep in mind.
One other point, though, is you want to be careful not to take too much, especially of something that's like a native plant. But foragers can do the role of what, animals have traditionally always done, which is to, if you have invasive plants, and there's a lot of areas in the country that are having huge issues with invasive plants just running over native ecosystems. Something like kudzu in the southeast is just destroying water systems. And a lot of these invasive plants are edible and they're pretty good. And so for the most part, if you learn what an invasive plant is and you want to go and forage for it, go for it. Yeah. Take it all. Get rid of it, because they need the highway. People need to come and chop that grass down, but you can go by and pick all those little berries or get that grain or herb or whatever it is. Like, go out and forage and learn what invasives are, because you will do great things for your local environment by removing that stuff. So.
Amen. That is so true. We have something here that I hadn't learned before, because where I came from, kudzu was one of the biggest invasive plants. In Tennessee, it'll be taking over miles of the highway. But up here, we have this little plant called birdvetch, and it produces these beautiful little purple flowers, and it's honestly a beautiful vine. It's so curly and twisty and beautiful, the leaves and the little purple flowers, and it just gets covered in purple flowers. And I just learned this year that you can make jellies and all kinds of stuff, and they're everywhere. They're also beautiful edible flowers that you can use, just to decorate your food and stuff. So yeah, learning about what things are invasive in your area and crossing that over with what you can do with it, you can be a really powerful force for your native community for sure. Great point. I loved that. So one thing I really wanted to talk about that you actually brought to my attention, and now that I've done more research on this story, I want to know about this mushroom story.
Okay,
and
so
Christmas,
this is,
how it
we're talking about
the story of
fly
Christmas.
agaric mushroom, or the Amanita muscaria. And I mentioned it earlier, but it is the classic red mushroom with little white spots on top. It's an Amanita. And it's often referred to as like a magic or a psychedelic mushroom, which is sort of true, but it's not magic in the way that we assume psilocybe or psilocybin-containing mushrooms are magic. It contains two pretty potent chemicals that are in the red membrane on top of Amanita muscaria. There is a compound called ibotenic acid, and then there's muscimol. So ibotenic acid, when we consume it, makes us violently ill, like diarrhea, puking, all that jazz. Terrible stomach ache. You do not feel good. Muscimol is sort of a dissociative psychedelic that's kind of similar, I've heard, to like the date rape drug GHB. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's like a fully positive experience, but it will definitely make you feel weird. And the story goes is that there was in Siberia and traditional sort of Russian folklore, there was these Siberian shamans who would go around and they wanted to experience the psychedelic effects, but they didn't want to experience the sickness. So what they realized is they could watch reindeer go around and eat these Amanita muscaria mushrooms, and whether or not reindeers experience the psychotropic effects is kind of up in the air, but it's certainly been proven across many different animals that they like to eat things that make them feel weird. Monkeys love, eating semi-fermented fruit and getting a little wonky. Even the fact that human beings can digest alcohol is probably something we evolved from monkeys eating, semi-rotten fruit. But so the idea is that the shamans would track these reindeer herds and collect the pee, maybe even like the yellow snow, and then they'd eat that for the psychotropic effects. But I think some of this idea was planted in that there was like a cultural practice of shamans going around gifting these Amanita muscaria to people. And this has, over the years, evolved into a narrative which, if you actually talk to a cultural anthropologist, will tell you this is false. But there has been a narrative that's evolved. That's a very cute story, and I guarantee you'll see it come up as Christmas comes around, but you can know that it's not actually true, in that the whole sort of myth of Santa Claus was derived from these Siberian shamans going around gifting these red and white mushrooms, and that kind of accounts for jolly old St. Nick's, red coat and white trim and beard and stuff like that. So that's not a real story, but it is compelling and it's fun to tell. And so I guarantee you that you'll see it pop up sometime during the Christmas season. You can do a quick Google search and read that it's not really, accepted as fact, but it's a fun story. The other cool thing about Amanita muscaria is, so it's the most recognizable mushroom in the world for sure. It also grows all around the world because it has been moved around from human activities, and it's a very good mycorrhizal partner for a lot of mushrooms. So I mentioned in New Zealand, it's actually become an invasive mushroom there, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not a harmful mushroom in the sense that people always assume it's toxic, and it is toxic in that it'll make you vomit and have diarrhea, but it's not deadly toxic. There are other amanitas like the destroying angel, which looks fairly similar, but has kind of this like deathly green cap, or the destroying angel is the white one, and then the death cap is the one that has the deathly green cap. But those both contain this amatoxin, which is a heat stable toxin that's very, very poisonous and will bind irreversibly to proteins in your liver and then shut down all liver function and cause death within a couple of days. So that's a really gnarly one. And that's why, for the most part, if you're a beginning mushroom hunter, just avoid amanitas in general. You don't need to eat them. There are some great edibles, but there's also ones that can kill you. So, just be safe and don't eat amanitas. But that being said, muscaria is probably the most recognizable of all the amanitas. And you can boil this twice in like good salted water for like 5 or 10 minutes and leach out most of the ibotenic acid. And what you're left with is white, delicious amanita flesh. And you can just fry that up in a pan with a little bit of butter. And it's a really good edible mushroom, has great texture. I've made like a ceviche with it too. You can kind of like squeeze some lime juice, some onions and that kind of stuff. And so the Amanita muscaria is a great sort of example of mycophobia and people projecting their own ideas onto a mushroom. Because everyone wants to assume, oh, it's psychedelic. You're like, well, it's psychedelic, but not in the way that you think it is. It's not going to give you a euphoric high the way that psilocybin mushroom would. And they're like, well, it's really toxic. You're like, well, it's a little toxic, but it's not going to kill you. And in fact, you can make it edible just like you would treat a vegetable by boiling it a couple times or preparing it a certain way. And that's, so it's so funny that people have all these preconceived notions about a mushroom. And they're almost all wrong, including the idea that, they were given by shamans, which was true, but it's not really what led to like the whole, genesis of Santa Claus being red and white. So, again, I think that's just a great example of where we can help educate the world and potentially shift people's perceptions and ideas about a mushroom that they think they know everything about. So
I think that is so interesting. And yes, with a quick Google search, you can find so much about this Santa story, this shaman story, even them growing underneath those mushrooms. They say were growing underneath pine trees, and that's another reason that you bring your pine tree indoors and you put red and white presents underneath it. It's hilarious. It's a great story, and there's it's definitely something you can tell swirls around year after year. So you guys will all now know the true story of that. But it's definitely really fascinating. And with what you were saying about mushrooms being so misunderstood in so many ways, if you could clear any misunderstanding about mushrooms.
And yeah, so I mean, I see mushrooms and I see fungi as these just incredible biological glue that is keeping our world together. And the more that we ignore them, the looser those connections become, the more that we ignore the fact that a forest is a whole living organism and not just the trees in the forest. There's that expression, it's hard to see the forest through the trees kind of thing. And you have to recognize that so much of life exists as these sort of holo organisms, that everything is connected. And it's not hippie to say that. It's like you said, it's tangibly by science, these things are connected, they're communicating, and we're part of that. And in the way that human beings have influenced the surface of the planet, we're in a whole new age. We're in the Anthropocene. We have fundamentally altered the surface of this planet to the point that it would be unrecognizable to any other point in history because of our human activities. And the more we push into the forest, the more we push into areas trying to expand things and burn trees down to plant crops and fields, we don't need more arable land at the moment. What we need is to preserve the ecosystems that we have, try to rebuild some of the ones we've destroyed, and we need to relook at our own practices through the lens of fungi, through the lens of plants, and start to understand that so many of these things can be improved through just mindfulness and changing our practices. And you mentioned earlier dumping on fertilizer. That's one of the things that disrupts the back and forth relationship between plants and fungi. Because if the plant has so much nitrogen that it doesn't need a fungi, it might just cast the fungi off. And so we've gotten really good at selecting for plants that respond to our inputs, but we haven't necessarily been good at selecting for plants that respond well to their fungal partners and respond well to like regenerative agriculture. So we have to completely frame shift the way that we do things. Otherwise, we're in serious trouble. But again, I guess I would look at mushrooms as being our partner for the future. You know, in the ways that plants partnered with fungi to terraform the planet, I think we can look back at fungi and say, how can we recoup? How can we mitigate some of the damage that we've done? And we're going to have to partner with fungi to make it happen.
Have you seen any of that going on?
There's vineyards here in California that use mushroom compost when they're getting started, and that has helped them get a much stronger plant base and make the vineyard more productive. But the big sexy thing would be bioremediation by fungi, and that's the idea of trying to reclaim polluted areas with fungi and using fungi as a way to sequester heavy metals, as a way to degrade hydrocarbons. And actually, the mushroom I mentioned earlier, the Pisolithus, the dieball, is one that they've used. I know, like I saw a talk about this giant abandoned Superfund mining site that was in Germany. And what they were seeing was none of the trees could get established because there was no capacity for them to grow onto this like very heavily compacted soil that was contaminated with heavy metals and just gross after 50 years of open pit mining kind of stuff. But they were able to see that some Pisolithus were coming up. And wherever the Pisolithus established, the pines were able to establish. And so that was giving the partnership there between this dieball and the pine species was enough to kind of sequester some of the heavy metals and to make the soil habitable again by aerating it and letting the roots grow in. And so we're looking slowly at the capacity for fungi and plants to reclaim areas and effectively bioremediate some of the damage we've done. But, stuff like heavy metals sticks around. Mushrooms are really good at bioaccumulating it, but just because they've biomagnified it into one area just means now you have a concentrated pocket of heavy metals. And it's also to the point that if you're looking at gathering mushrooms, a lot of them do bioaccumulate heavy metals. So like maybe don't collect mushrooms along the side of a highway where you might have had lead gasoline and stuff like that. So just, always, again, be cautious and be aware of where you might harvest a mushroom. But yeah, I think bioremediation is the thing that we look at that could be a real big application for fungi. And even we've seen certain fungi that can degrade plastics, and hoping that, maybe we can find a way to mitigate some of the issues we've had with just putting microplastics all over the planet. Fingers crossed.
I've recently seen something about mushrooms' potential towards breaking down microplastics, which would go back to, how it broke down the original stones of the planet.
Life finds a way. And fungi, again, are amazing in that they have a lot of DNA repair capacity. So that's one of the things that fungi do is they pack their cells with these sort of antioxidants, and they pack themselves with stuff that will help if they start replicating their DNA and there happens to be, radioactive stuff causing damage. They have mechanisms to repair some of that damage and to kind of mitigate the effects of that radiation, which human beings, we have all those same enzymes, but maybe not to quite the same degree. And we are more complicated. So if you make small changes in us, we get cancers, whereas mushrooms can sort of be more tolerant of that kind of stuff. And they're a little more dynamic in the way they manage their genomes. So yeah, there's potential everywhere, but it's just a matter of how do we capture it and how do we make sense of it. So.
It's amazing how many worlds exist within this world. You just focus on something a little bit and it just expands and expands and expands. So I'm curious where we can continue to follow your journey and support you and what you have coming up ahead online.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for asking. My first thing I'd say, go to my website, fascinatedbyfungi.com. People are always asking me, how do I get started in foraging? What books should I get? What resources should I use? And I have a frequently asked questions thing on my website. And that I've tried to put in as much kind of good information as I can. I mentioned the website iNaturalist is a really good thing you can do. I got a lot of value out of using social media. And I know it sounds kind of weird, but I started an Instagram account, just mushrooms. I only follow mushroom accounts, and it's nice because I can log on to that and I'm not worried about seeing someone else's vacation or someone else's kid or feeling the things you normally feel with social media. I'm just looking at mushrooms. And I'm pretty militant about it. If someone posts a picture of a baby, I'm unfollowing them. Mushrooms only. So I like the social media. You can definitely check me out on Instagram. I've moved to doing a lot of stuff on TikTok, which is an incredibly interesting, weird platform that allows me to reach demographics that I probably wouldn't access otherwise. And I've gotten a huge number of followers on TikTok too, which is really cool. Doing my best to try to educate the world in an entertaining and an engaging manner. My ultimate hope is to have a mushroom TV show. And I need to start filming some long form content for YouTube because I have a YouTube channel as well. I do a lot of cooking. So for sure, if you want to check out my cooking, you can look on my Instagram, on my YouTube. I have a Patreon as well where I'm posting mushroom recipes. So I made it, it's like $1 a month. It's the smallest amount of money I could possibly make it. In fact, Patreon doesn't even want me charging that little, but I was like, I don't care. I just want people to like support me if they can and check out my recipes. You can find cool original mushroom t-shirt designs on my website, as well as mugs. I've worked with artists because when I went into like getting into mushrooms, I was like, there's really every single piece of mushroom merchandise that's out there is pretty much Amanita muscaria, and that's it. It's the red and white mushroom. And I was just like, I don't want to wear that. There's certain archetypes associated with that mushroom. I was like, I want to create my own design. So I worked with artists hand in hand, kind of coming up with the design and feeding it into their artistic process, and then giving some feedback and getting some designs that I've been really excited about.
I love some of the ones I've seen you wear in your lives and stuff. I love the circle with all the mushrooms on the outside. It's cute.
Yeah, those are fun ones. But pre-quarantine, I had a bunch of cool public speaking things coming up, and I did like a vegan tea room event where all the dishes were like mushroom based, and I'm hoping to get into some of that stuff once we kind of relieve the stress of COVID. But right now I'm just excited that mushroom season is coming soon and really stoked to get out into the woods and find some good mushrooms. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us, and definitely follow Fascinated by Fungi on his TikTok and on Instagram. He goes live quite a bit. You can chat with him and learn a lot more, ask questions. He's really, really, really great and super entertaining to follow. I do the same thing I'm very militant about my Instagram page. My one is about plants only, and that is what all of this is about. And it's really nice to just go there and get a lot of inspiration about whatever it is that you're passionate about. So thank you so much. I get so many questions about mushrooms, and people don't understand that it's a whole different world from plants. I'm a botanist, not a mycologist, and understanding them is a whole different world. And so I'm just thankful to have your expertise on here and to answer some questions and really just teach us some fascinating things I did not know about this crazy world of mushrooms. So it sounds like there's enough. We might have to bring you on for a take 2 here. In the future, we can expand even more. But thank you so, so much, Gordon.
Sure, yeah, thank you for having me. And I hope that everyone feels a little fascinated by fungi after this interview. So
I definitely am.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Learning about the fungi kingdom was absolutely fascinating, wasn't it? And this is just barely a taste of all the magic and wonder Gordon's many channels have to offer if you feel pulled to explore this topic even further. This kingdom has an important role to play in the regeneration of our wild planet and the impact humans have had on it. It's up to us to give more attention to the things that cause this planet to flourish. Fungi, mycelium, yeast, lichen, plants, and trees are among them. Let's treat them with care. My challenge for you this week is to find a mushroom photo in your camera roll and research to identify it. If you feel called, share a photo with us on Instagram by tagging Among the Jungle. And be sure to keep up with us on Instagram, where I drop lives, challenges, IGTVs, as well as TikTok at Among the Jungle for short videos on plants, planet, and positivity. While you're there, be sure to follow Fascinated by Fungi on all his social medias, but especially Instagram and TikTok. The show notes for this episode can be found at amongthejungle.com/022. If you love mushrooms, be sure to share this episode with your favorite mushroom-loving friends. I hope this episode inspired your wild, and I hope you feel inspired knowing that everything is truly connected, and that even we are connected through listening to this podcast. Go forth and share the magic of mushrooms with others. And until next week, jungle dwellers, love, light, and aloha.
I am so grateful to the plants that bless this beautiful earth, and to you for choosing to nurture a wild place inside of your heart. I hope this episode inspired your wild, and I'd love to hear your feedback, suggestions for future guests, and other botanical notes at amongthejungle.com or amongthejungle on Instagram. It's been lovely exploring this exotic world with you today, and I look forward to where the journey takes us next week. Mahalo for tuning in, and stay wild.